All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. We're going to get started. My name is Phil Johnston. I'm the branch director of Cafe Vancouver, and I'll be your host for tonight's event, Parental Alienation, a Form of Father and Child Abuse. Our speaker's presentation will be approximately 45 minutes long, followed by a short break. Afterwards, we'll commence a Q&A session where you can ask him questions or make comments. Tonight's event is hosted by the student club SFU Advocacy for Men and Boys. I'd like to invite up the club's vice president to say a few words. Please welcome Liam Wilson.
Hi everybody, my name is Liam Wilson, as Phil introduced me. I'm glad to see so many people here actually. We haven't held an event now for a couple semesters. Last summer we decided to just take a break because we were all very busy. And in the fall a lot of our executives had graduated, so we were kind of picking up the pieces. So our exec team has shrunk to only about 2 people now, unfortunately, but we still plan to keep chugging along. Currently, alongside this event, we've been working on getting approval for a research survey on campus at SFU Burnaby, surveying all students there essentially on men's health and men's issues, with the hope that possibly the results will point towards the need for an SFU men's center, which has been a dream of a lot of the execs and a goal of this club from the very beginning. So if you are an SFU student or know an SFU student who would be interested in coming and helping out, just come up to us afterwards and let us know, and we'd love to get in touch and have more faces helping at these events. But yeah, thank you all for coming out, and I look forward to this presentation. I hope you do too. Thank you.
Thanks, Liam. Since 2015, it's been my privilege to act as branch director for Cafe Vancouver. But as of tonight, I am stepping down, which is both sad and exciting for me. I'm proud of the advocacy work I've done and the community I've helped build. I hope to stay involved as I move on to a new chapter in my life where I'll be more focused on career and family. I'd like to thank all the people that made the position such a rewarding one. And I'd like to thank them for choosing to publicly advocate for men's issues, because it's an area of advocacy where words of thanks and support are often in short supply, but criticism abounds with occasional condemnation. Not too much, but it does happen. So the people I want to thank, Liam. I want to thank Liam, the Vice President of SFU AMB, for all the hard work he's been putting into the SFU Men's Center and pushing that forward. Gigi, the club president, unfortunately she couldn't be here tonight, but her high spirits have always made organizational meetings fun. You really need those people. They can make all the difference. James, our videographer, who has tirelessly filmed all of our events, always says yes. I don't know how. He's always available. I want to say thanks and hi to Kevin, Vancouver's first branch director, who had the balls to actually start the branch. It wouldn't exist without him. He was just like, why not? He had virtually no help. And I'd like to thank Enya, Jesse, and Theron, who have all graduated and moved on, but they were foundational to starting SFU Advocacy for Men and Boys, promoting clubs at other local universities, and supporting me and my work with Cafe. The last person I want to thank is Cafe Vancouver's new branch director. He's been involved from the beginning, met with me many, many times to share words of advice and support, and most importantly, he has big plans for where the branch will go in the future. I'd like to invite him up to introduce himself. Please welcome Rob Cray.
Excuse me. And Phil, these are big shoes to fill, taking over this role. And I do have some goals to around moving Cafe forward. One of them that really is the unwritten goal is really landing on the issue of equality. And I welcome the women in the room, and I hope that future events there'll be more women in the room, and really want to get that conversation going between the genders. Excuse me, I've been fighting this cough. So my primary goal, we have two centers for men and family, one in Toronto, one in Ottawa. I'd like the third one, freestanding brick and mortar center, to be in Vancouver. I'm hoping by the end of this year we'll be able to open doors. So that is my primary goal. The secondary goal, of course, we'll need to do a lot of fundraising to make that happen. And so I'm looking for that, to build that community with the local folks, anyone interested in volunteering and helping out.
Our speaker is an author, an associate professor of social work at the University of British Columbia, specializing in child and family policy. As a child and family social worker in Canada and the UK, he has practiced in the fields of welfare rights, child protection, school social work, hospital social work, and family services. This man is very experienced. He is currently teaching and practicing in the areas of family, mediation, and addiction. Tonight, he will present his recent research on parental alienation from the perspective of alienated parents, and connect that to existing research on parental alienation as a form of domestic violence, as well as existing research on parental alienation as a form of emotional abuse of children. Please welcome Dr. Edward Crook.
Okay, well, right off the bat, I'd like to thank both SFU AMB and CAFE, and particularly Phil and Rob and Liam, of course, for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you on this important subject area, which is kind of a hot button issue, not only here in Canada, but internationally. I wanted to begin by saying just a few words about the title of parental alienation as a form of father and child abuse. Despite the title, I really don't consider this to be a gender issue or a father's issue per se. Both fathers and mothers are victims of parental alienation, and both fathers and mothers are perpetrators of parental alienation. In fact, I've just returned a week ago from the Middle East and spent a lot of time in Iran, particularly. There's a great deal of interest in parenting after divorce, of course, because their divorce rates are no different than ours here. But the outcomes are very different when parents can't agree on post-divorce living arrangements for their children, and the courts get involved. It's considered, children are considered to be father's property in Iran. And I had been invited to speak on the topic of family mediation. I think that's the solution the state there is really favoring, to divert as many cases or high conflict situations away from the courts to the mediation arena. And I think of all, you know, it was my second time actually in Iran to speak on this topic. But I suggested while I was there the idea of speaking about shared parenting as a viable alternative to this winner-take-all kind of regime where fathers are, you know, granted sole custody and control of children. And it could not have come at a better time in Iran, actually. There's a great deal of discussion about women's rights at the moment. I think I heard more about women's rights issues in Iran than even here in Canada, where, you know, it's quite prevalent. And very much shared parenting was immediately seen as an important women's rights issue, that so many mothers are the victims of parental alienation in that country. So I did several presentations on the topic, and it kind of caught fire. And in fact, there are several PhD students who have decided to switch their thesis focus from whatever they were doing on, you know, in the area of child and family social work to looking at shared parenting, different aspects of shared parenting. So what is parental alienation? Basically, parental alienation is a form of indoctrination of children perpetrated by one parent to turn the children's hearts and minds against the other parent. basically to force children to hate one of their parents. It's not, hatred of a parent isn't an emotion that comes naturally to children. It has to be taught. It usually takes place in the context of custody disputes during divorce. And parental alienation is most likely to take hold when children are residing primarily with only one of their parents. And so that's why it affects more fathers in Canada than it does mothers. But we're seeing also a pattern of, there's still a great reluctance on the part of courts here to consider shared parenting as a viable option for families in conflict. But we've seen an upsurge in the number of paternal custody determinations, and then mothers are excluded and at risk of parental alienation. So mothers are affected as well. I write a column on this topic of parenting after divorce for Psychology Today, and the columns that I've written on parental alienation have been probably the most popular and have resulted in a lot of discussion and comment and strong feelings, both for and against the concept of parental alienation. But I get a lot of inquiries every day, probably about half a dozen or more, from parents directly or grandparents, and I'm seeing just as many women writing on concerned about parental alienation as I am fathers. So many mothers are affected by parental alienation. Parental alienation is also a form of individual child abuse. I think there's more and more recognition of that, but even more so, I see it as a form of collective child abuse, meaning that when one parent is removed from the life of a child, that really, in a sense, is a form of alienation in itself. And our social policies are such that almost, and legal, socio-legal policies are such that almost encourage people to alienate the other parent from the lives of their kids. We do have a viable alternative to the present winner-take-all sole custody system, and that is shared parenting. But it's not really being considered by the courts very much. So, so I guess I'm saying both shared parenting and parental alienation are seen or rather framed as fathers' rights issues. I think that's a tactic to kind of marginalize these issues rather than a true reflection of what's happening out there. I'm talking about shared parenting because, as you will see as I go through my presentation, shared parenting is really the bulwark against parental alienation. It's the most effective strategy to deal with parental alienation, especially as a form of collective child abuse. We can prevent the great majority of parental alienation situations just by a fundamental change in the law in the direction of shared parenting. Just a few words about myself. Phil mentioned that I'm teaching in the School of Social Work at UBC. I've been there for over 25 years actually. And child and family social work is my area of specialization, and I've worked also in different capacities as a social worker in child and family, child protection. I've worked in the school system. I've worked in a children's hospital, as well as working in family services and doing some divorce mediation. I've been teaching a course on divorce mediation or family mediation since I started at UBC. My research is also in these areas. I started out looking at the experiences of divorced fathers back 25 years ago or so, and why it is that so many fathers lose contact with their children after separation and divorce. There was this phenomenon of the deadbeat dad that prevailed back then. It was just assumed that the staggering rates of father absence in North America, it was up to 50% of non-custodial fathers eventually lost all contact with their children. It was just simply assumed that it was a matter of fathers not being interested their children or maintaining their roles as fathers after separation. And I very much challenge that in my research. I did a cross-national study, Canada and the UK, looking at the experiences of divorced fathers without custody of their children and the reasons behind their loss of contact. And it challenged many of the kind of myths and assumptions about fathers. But since that time, I've mainly researched the standpoint of the most severely affected groups in regard to divorced family members. The most negatively affected, I'm talking about grandparents who are at risk of losing all contact with their children. I'm talking about fathers who are alienated from their children, also mothers who are alienated from their children and children themselves. And these are the voices that are rarely heard in research studies. Those who have suffered from broken attachments. There's been quite a lot of research, as I'll detail today, on parental alienation, but it's been mainly looking at the less severe forms of alienation, just behaviors that parents engage in to kind of undermine the child's relationship with the other parent. My research is focused on those parents, mothers, and fathers who've lost all contact, who haven't seen their kids in 6 months or a year or several years. I should also say that I'm a father of 2 boys and also a non-custodial father who's really struggled over the years to maintain a relationship with both my sons. And I've seen the short-term and the long-term effects of parental alienation on my own kids, which in a way is kind of advantageous to have experienced that as a researcher, but also it's all consuming, and I can say, that if you allow the effects of parental alienation to consume you, it can kill you. It's really a debilitating condition, but it's also an energizing force behind the work that I do. So I'm not only professionally immersed, but also personally immersed in this whole field of parental alienation, and well aware and have experienced firsthand this whole issue of the system being the main problem when it comes to the issue of parental alienation. As a social worker, my orientation is always to look at the structural or the systemic determinants of social problems like child custody and parental alienation. And I've become a very strong advocate of shared parenting as a legal presumption and as a remedy to address parental alienation. And shared parenting is truly in the best interests of children because it's preventative of parental alienation. I'm very involved in the whole field of shared parenting research after divorce. It's a lot of my own research is in this area. I have a book on entitled The Equal Parent Presumption, which looks at the research on child and family outcomes in shared parenting versus sole custody homes. And the book also focuses on how governments around the world can establish shared parenting as the foundation of family law. But I'm also very involved in an organization, the International Council on Shared Parenting, of which I'm president. And that's been going for about 4 or 5 years now. We've had 3 international conferences and another one coming up in Strasbourg in France later in this year in November. And that's a very unique organization that I'd really, those of you interested in shared parenting as a way to address parental alienation, you might want to check out twohomes.org. That's the website of the International Council on Shared Parenting. We're a unique organization in that we have an equal number of 3 groups. First of all, academics, people who are researching shared parenting. Secondly, child and family professionals who are involved day to day in working directly with parents and children. And thirdly, NGOs and members of civil society, advocates for shared parenting. It's a really good blend, and And it's a unique organization in that sense. We have the proceedings of our latest conference are being published in the Journal of Child Custody in a few weeks. Let's move on to the next slide. So just to give you a sense of where things are at with shared parenting around the world, we definitely are seeing quite a paradigm shift occurring in regard to this notion of parental responsibility. And when I talk about shared parenting, I'm really talking about shared parenting responsibility as opposed to rights. I consider the research I do to proceed more from a child-focused perspective rather than a parent-focused perspective or professionally focused perspective. And when I talk about shared parenting responsibility, I'm really trying to kind of put forward two key concepts which I think are really prevalent in the field of in divorce law reform around the world. The first is this notion of the best interests of the child being kind of a flawed concept because it's a discretionary criterion, and I'll talk about this. The need to replace the discretionary approach, that is, having a judge decide on the basis of very limited knowledge of child development, if any knowledge of child development and family dynamics, having a judge determine what is in the best interest of a child, versus a kind of more of an evidence-based, child-focused, best interest of the child from the perspective of the child criterion to replace that vague and discretionary standard that we have now. So there's much more emphasis on child-focused legal determination. And secondly is this notion of responsibility taking precedence over rights. A responsibility to children's needs to replace the dominant rights-based approach. And I'm talking here about the responsibilities of both parents to their children's needs, and even more so the responsibility of social institutions like legal and judicial institutions to support parents in the fulfillment of their parenting responsibilities to their children's needs. Okay, next slide. This is my agenda for this evening then. It's kind of a blend of reporting on what the current research is telling us, and then looking at, how can we move forward to address parental alienation. So I'll talk a bit about parental alienation as a form of domestic violence, meaning violence against parents, the targeted alienated parents. In this case, I'm talking mainly about fathers in a Canadian context. And then I'll talk about parental alienation as a form of child abuse, what the research tells us about that, and then looking at implications for practice with divorcing families, but more so for social and legal policy and law reform. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background information before I kind of launch into parental alienation. I mentioned a moment ago how did all this start for me was 25 years ago or so, when I had been working as a school social worker for many years and decided to then return and complete a PhD, and on the topic of father absence, which was quite a widespread phenomenon. And the goal of that research was to look at why so many, the experience of divorced fathers, but also why so many lose contact with their children. And I did a follow-up study 20 years later to the original study 25 years ago, so about 5 years ago. And then I also have done research on the perspective of non-custodial mothers, which has been largely overlooked in the literature. And basically 4 key findings from that body of research. And that very much relates to, when we talk about fathers, the experience of fathers is one of a very profound grief reaction that contains all the major elements of a bereavement. That's the result of that's the main experience that fathers go through during and after separation and divorce. When I did the follow-up study 20 years after the original research that kind of talked about this deep grief reaction, I thought the situation for fathers would have improved, but actually it hadn't improved. It got worse, and I was seeing more of a full-blown kind of PTSD scenario for fathers 20 years later. Fathers' involvement with their children had risen during that time, and the effect of being removed from the daily life of children was that much more profound for fathers. A second finding in this research was that fathers attribute the gender bias of the court system, but also the discouragement of their lawyers as the reason why they don't pursue legal kind of determination of shared parenting or sole custody. They're told their chances are very poor, and the legal system seems to dissuade fathers from, from even trying to get what they really want. 80% of the fathers I interviewed stated very clearly they wanted their children to live with them at least part of the time. A third finding was very unexpected. I found that previously very engaged and involved fathers in children's lives were the ones that seemed to be most at risk of just complete loss of contact. It was fathers who were maybe less involved in their kids' lives to begin with that found the constraints of a visiting relationship to be easy to kind of negotiate and work through. And for some fathers, they actually became closer to their children after separation. But the most highly involved, most attached and fathers seem to have the worst outcomes in regard to their ability to remain in the picture in their children's lives. And probably the key finding from all that research was this one, that non-custodial fathers' disengagement from their children's lives results from a combination of structural constraints, that is, being removed as day-to-day caregivers of their children, and their own psychological response to the loss of their children and loss of the pre-divorce father-child relationships. So basically, that body of research has been published and I think fairly widely disseminated, and I think there's clearly a recognition now that child absence profoundly affects fathers, and fathers' disengagement from their children's lives is not a matter of just being footloose and fancy-free, free from responsibility, but in fact the consequences are quite grave for fathers. And given all the constraints and all the factors that really work against fathers staying in the picture, it's surprising how many fathers actually do manage to stay in the picture. So this myth of the deadbeat dad, I think, has been scrutinized, and it's now been relegated to the dustbin of history, I believe, although some people still cling to that notion. But I think in the professional community, there's a recognition that children are very important to fathers, and the loss of children from the day-to-day lives of fathers is really quite profound. We also have seen a great deal of research looking at the effects of father absence on children, and just as child absence profoundly affects fathers, so father absence profoundly affects children. So about 10 or 15 years ago, there were any number of articles that challenged the research that was suggesting that children are really not doing very well with, in father-absent homes. There was a seminal article titled "Deconstructing the Essential Father," which basically said, okay, there's a correlation between, father absence in children's lives and poor outcomes. It doesn't necessarily mean that father absence is causing these problems. It's likely more to be child poverty, and mothers being stressed, and fathers being unsupportive of children, rather than that children's circumstances really differed, and many children were doing just fine without their fathers. So that was the thinking 10 or 15 years ago. But now, I think today, that's changed quite dramatically. We have a huge body of research on the effects of father absence. And we also have a bit of a consensus statement among fatherhood researchers about the causal effects of father absence. So there have been a series of articles, one major article that came out a couple of years ago entitled about the causal effects of father absence. There's a direct link between the between father absence and a wide range of outcomes. The results are nothing short of disastrous for children, and I've got them on this next slide summarized. We know that father's absence is very much associated with children's diminished self-concept, their threatened physical and emotional security. Children consistently report feeling abandoned. When their fathers aren't involved in their lives, they struggle with their emotions, they struggle with self-loathing and self-hatred, which is really quite an extreme reaction with very severe consequences. Behavioral problems. Fatherless children have much more difficulty with social adjustment, report more problems with friendships. Some develop a bit of an intimidating, swaggering persona in an attempt to disguise their underlying fears, anxieties, and unhappiness. Others just withdraw and are very socially isolated. Truancy in academic performance is affected. 71% of high school dropouts are fatherless. Absent children have more trouble academically. Children from father-absent homes are more likely to play truant. They're less likely to attain academic and professional qualifications in adulthood. Delinquency and youth crime, including violent crime. So 85% of youth in prison have an absent father. Fatherless children are more likely to offend and go to jail as adults. Promiscuity and teen pregnancy. Fatherless children more likely to experience problems with sexual health. Greater likelihood of becoming teenage parents, contracting sexually transmitted infection. Girls manifest an object hunger for males, and experiencing the emotional loss of their fathers as a rejection of them, they're susceptible to exploitation by adult men. Drug and alcohol abuse, homelessness, 90% of runaway children have an absent father. Exploitation and abuse, much greater risk of suffering physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. 5 times more likely to have experienced physical abuse and emotional maltreatment. 100 times higher risk of fatal abuse. A recent study reported that preschoolers not living with their fathers are 40 times more likely to be sexually abused. Physical health problems, mental health disorders, life chances as adults, fatherless children more likely to experience unemployment, have low incomes, experience homelessness, future relationships are affected, more likely to divorce or dissolve their cohabiting unions, more likely to have children outside marriage or outside any partnership, and finally mortality. Fatherless children are more likely to die as children. They live an average of 4 years less over the lifespan. So there's a massive body of research on the impact of father absence. And given that all of these social problems listed here correlate more strongly with fatherlessness than any other factor, surpassing race, social class, and poverty, it may well be one of the most critical, if not the most critical social issue of our time. Certainly David Blankenhorn in Fatherless America declares the crisis of fatherless children as the most destructive trend of our generation. And from Britain, we have a recent report from University of Birmingham, Dad and Me, concludes that the need for a father is on an epidemic scale, with father deficit be, being the need for father deficit being addressed as a public health issue. So one of the consequences of increased awareness of the effects of father absence is that more attention is being paid to encouraging paternal involvement after divorce, with this shift from parental rights and mother's rights versus father's rights to this idea of parental responsibility as the main framework for determining living arrangements after separation. And I wanted to say a few words before I kind of launch into the parental alienation discussion about this historical legal development of parental responsibility. If we could move to the next slide. So for many years, a legal presumption that children were the property of fathers existed, like 100 years ago, but that was followed by a maternal preference based on this tender years presumption. Both of these sort of presumptions were replaced in the 1970s in Canada and in many countries around the world by the principle that custody ought to be decided according to what's in the best interests of the child. And this standard, the best interest of the child, was the foundation of Canada's Second Divorce Act in 1986. The wording of that Divorce Act reflects a very careful consideration for gender neutrality. I should really emphasize, because the Divorce Act itself, the intention was actually that there, with Mark McGuigan being the Justice Minister at the time, the intention was to encourage more of a gender balance or a shared parenting approach. But paradoxically, the new act actually coincided with a larger share of judicial determinations of sole maternal residence, even though the stated intent of the Divorce Act was to promote shared caregiving arrangements. Since that time, a major expansion of family law has occurred in Canada, with a lot of reliance on parental gender as a key factor in custody decisions. In recent years, there's been scrutiny and criticism of the gender bias against fathers in child custody disputes, and the court has responded with more primary residence decisions made in favor of fathers, but much less so shared parenting, which is seen as unworkable by a lot of judges when parents are in conflict. But shared parenting is beginning to be recognized and favored by some judges. It's now the preferred approach of North American parents in two-parent families, and also among those who don't litigate child custody. So it's replaced maternal custody as the most frequent kind of outcome for parents that make their own arrangements. But movement in the direction of shared parenting as a legal presumption has been really slow in Canada when courts have to make a decision. And shared parenting has been marginalized as a viable alternative by the legal establishment that that sort of considers it an outlandish proposition and a conspiracy of fathers' rights extremists that has to be resisted. So rather than any substantive changes to family law, what we see are superficial changes to the language of divorce. So custody is being, the words like custody are being replaced by residence and access by contact, but actually the outcomes are no different than they were before. The divorce industry is flourishing in Canada and the US, and that is clearly a major stumbling block to family law reform. The main problem with the best interest of the child approach in North America is that it's a discretionary standard. Judges with no training in family dynamics or child development are placed in the position of deciding the fate of children based on their own biases and preferences. And the main obstacle to family law reform is the reluctance on the part of judges, lawyers, and legislators to abandon the discretionary best interest standard. And when I say abandon this standard, I'm not proposing that we abandon the principle that the needs and interests of children should be the paramount consideration in parenting after divorce, but I'm arguing that the best interests of children should be clearly defined and based on available research evidence regarding children's needs and factors associated with their well-being after divorce, rather than being based on judicial discretion. I have the next slide looks at the flaws of the discretionary best interest standard, and I won't spend a lot of time on them, but I think there's a lot of writing about this idea that, especially in the realm of family law, judicial discretion is really a problematic kind of concept. So first of all, the best interest of the child standard is vague, indeterminate. Best interests are undefined. They lack legal consensus. They're based on judges' speculation about parents' future conduct. Secondly, the best interest standard, the discretionary standard, is based on judges' idiosyncratic biases in an area in which they have no training or expertise. So there's a lot of mistakes that judges make. They've got unfettered discretion. The outcomes are unpredictable and inconsistent. Their judges' reasons for judgment are all over the map. Thirdly, judges have still somehow have retained this sole custody presumption and bias. Judges simply assume that when there's parental conflict, children's best interests are best served by awarding care and control of children to one parent only. A fourth problem is that the discretionary standard sustains, intensifies, and creates conflict, fuels litigation. These are some of the most bitter battles waged in court. Fifth, the standard makes the court dependent on custody evaluations, but the scientific basis for child custody evaluation is hotly contested. The whole field of child custody evaluation lacks an empirical foundation. Next slide. The views of children and parents regarding best interests are very different to the views of judges. When you survey parents and children themselves, they talk about children's need for both parents in their lives, whereas judges, kind of when they think about best interests, they're really thinking about, well, which parent it's more of a deficit-based approach, identifying which parent is less suited to be the primary caregiver. This is based on research where judges have been asked, well, what does this mean to you, the best interest of the child? Seventh, there's really no basis in law or psychology for distinguishing one parent as primary over the other. With two adequate parents, there's really no basis to determine which is the better parent. An eighth point is that this standard is more of a smokescreen for the underlying issue of the judiciary and the legal system retaining the decision-making power in the child custody realm, which is really what judiciary does not want to give up. Ninth is contrary to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Children of divorce are discriminated against on the basis of parental status in regard to the removal of their parents from their lives. So it's really inaccurate to say that the court awards custody to one or the other parent. In fact, custody is held by both parents, and the court removes one parent from the life of a child based on the judge's own sort of determination in regard to which parent is the more suitable parent, and therefore a different standard is applied for children in two-parent families where it has to be shown that a child is in need of protection for a parent to be removed from a child's life, whereas there's an indeterminate standard vis-a-vis the protection of children's relationships with each of their parents in separated families. So we've got discrimination against children of divorce or separation on the basis of parental status. And finally, children's interests are largely unrepresented in court proceedings as custody contest pits the rights of mothers against the rights of fathers. So a very basic legal principle, hearkening back to Aristotle actually, is that the best laws are those that limit judicial discretion. And nowhere, I think, is this more relevant and true than in the case of family law. I'll move forward. And just one last piece before I move into talking about parental alienation. I've written, so there have been 60 articles published in the last decade alone, 60 major research studies published comparing child and parent outcomes in dual residence or shared parenting homes versus sole custody homes. And I won't go through the results of all the 60 studies, but what I've done is kind of extrapolate the main findings of these studies, which overwhelmingly have found that on every measure of divorce-specific adjustment and general adjustment, children are doing significantly better when they're able to reside in both parents' households in a shared parenting arrangement than where one parent has almost exclusive care and control of children. There have been really a range of findings in these studies, but I think I've organized them into 16 main themes. I think each of these represent a very strong argument in favor of adopting shared parenting as a legal presumption. Each of them, I think, is good enough reason to move towards shared parenting as the foundation of family law. But I think together it's pretty hard to argue against shared parenting as a new approach to family law in North America. So the first is that shared parenting preserves children's relationships with both parents, and that's connected to their physical and emotional sense of security. There have been, we know, I think, very strongly that the two most important factors in children's adjustment to divorce are maintaining meaningful relationships with both parents and also being shielded from parental conflict. There's a lot of debate about which is the more important factor, but the few studies that have been done that kind of have compared children in high conflict co-parenting families with children in father-absent families have found that children in high conflict situations are actually doing better than children in father-absent homes. But regardless, in fact, conflict levels go down with shared parenting, and they increase in situations where one parent has exclusive care. So secondly, shared parenting preserves parents' relationship with their children, and we know that the highest level of depression occurs among parents who have dependent children with whom they're not living. So we know that the outcomes for parents are very poor when they're excluded from their children's lives. Thirdly, shared parenting decreases parental conflict and prevents family violence. And I'll just say a few words about that because a lot of people react when they see this. They say, no, it's actually the opposite. The reason shared parenting is a bad idea is that it will expose children to more conflict in high conflict situations. In fact, the research has shown that over time, conflict diminishes when you have shared parenting established, and it increases when children reside with only one parent. One, I think, statistic that has not really been discussed as much as it should be is a finding that fully 50% of first-time family violence occurs during or after parental separation. Within the context of winner-take-all adversarial court proceedings. So the system is almost tailor-made to exacerbate conflict or create high conflict, and actually endangers parents and children, because when you have such high stakes involved and people are feeling threatened with the potential loss of their children, it's truly a recipe for disaster. So it's preventative of family violence, but it's also shared parenting is associated with increased cooperation between parents and lessened conflict, whereas sole custody arrangements, people continue to fight over, the non-resident parent is fighting for more contact, the residential parent is trying to limit the contact, and conflict escalates. A fourth argument is that shared parenting reflects children's preferences and views about their needs and best interests. We now have a body of research that is based on direct reports from children themselves about what is in their best interests. So a major study was done at the University at Arizona State University, where 850 young adult children of divorce, this is 18 to 20-year-olds, were surveyed about their views and preferences and their own take on their best interests. And 80% of these young adults said that equal time with each of their parents is in the best interest of children. So studies that have looked at children's own perspective as young adults who have lived through their parents' divorce are very strongly kind of favoring shared parenting. Shared parenting, number 5, reflects parents' preferences and views about their children's needs and best interests. So we have any number of public opinion surveys in Canada and the States that have asked parents what is the best outcome for children, what living arrangement in high conflict situations. And we have just as many mothers as fathers, women as men, about 80% of both women and men, slightly more women, identifying shared parenting as in children's best interests. Number 6, shared parenting reflects child caregiving arrangements before divorce. So we've seen a number of studies in Canada and the US. In Canada, it's mainly the National Work-Life Conflict Study that looks at parents' involvement in childcare roles and responsibilities in two-parent families, and we've seen a marked shift over a period of 20 years, and made a huge decline in the amount of time that mothers are spending with children because they have increased work responsibilities outside the home, but also a corresponding increase in the amount of time that fathers are devoting to childcare, so that shared parenting is really established now as the norm in two-parent families. And we encourage shared parenting in two-parent families, and yet we don't seem to do so after separation and divorce. Shared parenting enhances the quality of parent-child relationships. It's often said, well, don't be so concerned about quantity of time for fathers. Be more concerned about the quality of your relationships. Well, you can't really have good quality relationships without sufficient time, day-to-day routine time with children. Quantity of time is necessary for quality relationships. Number 8, shared parenting decreases parental focus on mathematizing time and reduces litigation. And there are abundant studies based on jurisdictions like Australia, Sweden, Netherlands, Belgium that have established shared parenting as in law. Litigation rates have been reduced dramatically. In Australia, 72% of parents who started out as being in conflict over residential arrangements did not make any use of lawyers at all. They were able to make use of mediation and other support services to facilitate development of a shared parenting plan. We'll move ahead to the next slide, and and this is the next point, that shared parenting provides an incentive for negotiation, mediation, and development of cooperative parenting plans. We see a huge uptake in the use of mediation where shared parenting law is in place. Number 10, shared parenting addresses the problem of judicial bias and provides a clear guideline for judicial decision making. Number 11, it reduces the risk and incidence of parental alienation. Number 12, enables enforcement of parenting orders. 13, it is most in line with imperatives regarding protection of children's rights, in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It addresses social justice imperatives regarding parental authority, autonomy, rights, and responsibilities. And finally, the discretionary best interest standard and sole custody model is not empirically supported, whereas a legal presumption of shared parenting is empirically supported. So moving on, thank you. I'll look at this 11th point that I just made. Shared parenting reduces the risk and incidence of parental alienation. Let's move on to the next slide. Yeah. So parental alienation, first of all, what is it? So parental alienation basically involves the programming of a child by one parent to denigrate the other so-called targeted parent in an effort to undermine and interfere with the child's relationship with that parent. It does not refer to cases where a child or a parent has been victimized by child abuse or family violence, and the child is fearful of the parent as a result of that. We're not talking about those situations. We're talking about unjustified rejection, unjustified hatred. So we now have over 1,000 research articles and books on the topic of parental alienation. And I think we're at a point where there's an emerging scientific consensus on the reality of parental alienation, but also on the effects of parental alienation. We know that parental alienation is much more common than it's been assumed. Jennifer Harmon, who is the only person I'm aware of that's actually done surveys of incidents of parental alienation in the US, had a representative sample, and found that 13% of parents in the US report having had some experience of alienation, either mild or moderate or severe. We also know that parental alienation is much more debilitating for children and parents than commonly assumed. So parental alienation very much falls on a continuum from undermining and interfering with a child's relationship with the other parent, then further along the continuum to actually instilling hatred toward that parent, further along the continuum to cutting off all contact between the child and the other parent, and finally, erasing a parent from the heart and mind of a child. Just complete erasure. That parent just doesn't exist, and there's no even mention of the existence of the other parent. So there is a scientific consensus on the reality of parental alienation, the incidence of parental alienation, and the debilitating effects. Where there's still controversy and debate is in regard to the questions of, is this in fact a form of domestic violence? Can we call it domestic violence? And can we actually go so far as to label parental alienation as a form of child abuse? So let's look at each of these. So being a researcher who studied intimate family relationships for about 4 decades, I liken the denial of parental alienation as a form of domestic violence to how much denial there was about other forms of domestic violence in the 19th and 20th centuries. There were a lot of public awareness campaigns back then to try to make people see that such violence wasn't acceptable, something had to be done about it, like this one from 1912. There are many reasons for such aggression back then and today, and much of it is tied in beliefs about intent and justification for aggression. So, next slide, I'd like to say a few words about human aggression, how I would define human aggression. Human aggression involves behaviors directed toward another individual with the proximate or the immediate intent to cause harm is the key. In order to be considered aggression, there must be a belief that the behavior will cause harm, and also that the target of the aggression is motivated to avoid it. That's sort of the classic definition of human aggression. intent to cause harm, and then motivation on the part of the victim to avoid. Human aggression can be either hostile or instrumental, with hostile aggression being thoughtless, unplanned behaviors done out of anger in reaction to a perceived provocation, and instrumental aggression being more planned, aggressive behaviors that are premeditated and expressed as a means to obtain some other goal in addition to hurting the target. The target is hurt in the process of the aggressor trying to obtain their goal. Next slide. Domestic violence is a very broad term that can be applied to any aggression in a domestic setting. The two specific forms of domestic violence relevant to our understanding of parental alienation are interpersonal violence and child abuse. And I'll begin with looking at interpersonal violence as a form of domestic violence. So next slide. The National Center for Injury Prevention in the US revised their definition of interpersonal violence recently to accommodate new forms of interpersonal violence like stalking. The most recent definition includes the 4 categories listed here: physical, sexual, stalking, and psychological aggression. And within psychological aggression, there are many different types. I'll review these in a few moments as they pertain to parental alienation, because psychological aggression, this is the primary type of behavior that alienating parents use. Next slide. Aside from these 4 types of interpersonal violence, there are several other types that are relevant to understanding parental alienation, like legal and administrative aggression. These are manipulative actions that one partner takes using legislative and administrative systems to hurt the other partner, such as threatening a partner with litigation, making false claims of abuse to child protective services, in order to block the other parent's relationship with the child. This form of aggression uses people in power to create more devastating consequences on the target: restrictions on visitation, threat of incarceration with allegations of abuse or violence. Institutional aggression is not as an act an individual does within an institutional setting like violence in jails, but as acts that institutions rather than individuals commit, such as incarcerating innocent people, banning an individual from access to privileges like voting, disproportionately imposing fines on groups of individuals for rule violations. Institutional aggression is not interpersonal violence in a technical sense, but it can be considered as interpersonal violence when the victim is targeted due to their domestic role, like a parent or an intimate partner. Next slide. So according to the Centers for Disease Control, there are several types of behaviors that fall under each dimension of psychological abuse. So these are different forms of psychological abuse that are common in parental alienation situations: expressive aggression, so name-calling or degradation. Alienating parents use negative and derogatory words to refer to the other parent, directly to the child or within the child's earshot. The alienator may also refer to the other parent using their first name in order to undermine their authority, refer to the other parent using third-person pronouns, which essentially creates the perception that the other parent is impersonal. Many times the types of names or descriptions of the target parent to the child and others imply that the target parent is dangerous or mentally unstable and therefore not fit as a parent. The alienating parent may tell the child that the other parent doesn't love or care about them. They may limit all mention of the other parent to erase them, which is the ultimate form of degradation. Humiliating. The alienating parent will mock the other parent's hobbies, personality, job, friends, family, and the child may be mocked for being like the other parent. Acting angry in a way that seems dangerous. The alienating parent will yell at the other parent in front of the child, slam doors, throw things. They may also call the police to make the other parent appear to be the dangerous one to the child. The parent may also get angry with the child for expressing loyalty to the other parent and threaten the child if they continue. The intent is to scare the child and the other parent into submission with these actions. The next slide is all about coercive control. Different forms of coercive control, including limiting access to transportation, money, friends, and family. Alienating parent will make pickups and drop-offs of children difficult to negotiate, constantly changing locations and times and availability of the children, turn family and friends against the parent to isolate them socially. They may limit access to medical and school records. Excessive monitoring of a parent's whereabouts and communications. Alienating parents will often monitor communications between the target parent and the children. They may have the children spy on them. They may monitor social media use excessively and have family or friends spy on the target parent. Monitoring or interfering with communication without permission. So the alienating parent will monitor all communication between the child and the other parent. They'll incessantly text, message, or call the children when in the target parent's care so as to interfere with their parenting time. Making threats to harm the self. The alienating parent may threaten to hurt themselves or commit suicide if the target parent continues to fight for the children. Making threats to harm a loved one or possession. Making threats about how the children will be financially destitute or psychologically traumatized by the target parent. They may threaten to get the other parent fired from their job or make threats to destroy the reputation of a new romantic partner or family members of the target parent. Threats of physical violence, I guess it's the next slide. The alienating parent will vandalize property when angered, send hostile emails or voicemails with threats. They may hire a bodyguard to give the appearance that they'll hurt the other parent if they try anything. They'll make threats to hurt the target parent such that the target parent will seek to avoid an altercation. Next slide. Exploiting liabilities of the victim, such as immigration status, disability, undisclosed sexual orientation. The alienating parent may blackmail the target parent. They may threaten the target parent so that they'll tell the kids something negative about them. They may use past indiscretions that have nothing to do with the children against the parent. They may use discrepancies in parenting time against the target parent. They make false reports regarding visa violations to have the target parent deported. All of these are tactics that have been well documented. Alienating parent may exploit their own vulnerabilities to control or limit the victim's options, using one's gender as an advantage to exploit the other parent, such as a woman portraying herself as a victim, or the father portraying the mother as mentally unbalanced or unmotherly. A belief in one's entitlement as the primary or sole parental figure in a child's life, or in lack of validation of the other parent as a parent, are all examples of this category. And finally, there is gaslighting, which is presenting false information to the victim with the intent of making them doubt their own memory and perception, commonly reported by alienated parents. Some alienators will send emails to the target parent intended to retell past events to create a new version of the past, affidavits and legal means to make people question their version of reality. Parents will readily accuse the other party of wrongdoing for behaviors that they themselves are doing, deflecting the responsibility to the other target parent. So just in summary, parental alienation is a form of domestic violence. These are the essential elements. So parental alienation falls on a continuum with differing effects depending on whether it's mild, moderate, or severe in regard to the effects on the target parent. We see a pattern of behaviors enacted over time by one parent to the other. The intent is to harm the other parent, and the target parent is motivated to avoid the behaviors. So turning to parental alienation as a form of emotional child abuse. So similar to domestic violence, parental alienation as a form of emotional abuse of children is exactly at the same level of public and professional awareness as child physical and sexual abuse was over a century ago. There was no child protection agency, over a century ago. The people who were advocating for recognition of child physical abuse found allies for their cause of child protection within the Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. In fact, child abuse intervention began as a subset of animal cruelty prevention. That's how unaware people were of the issue. There was widespread denial and opposition to the concept of child physical abuse. We see the same type of lack of awareness, denial, and opposition to parental alienation today, as professionals in particular tend to minimize its impact and extent. But I would suggest that parental alienation is an even more extreme form of abuse of children. Because of this, we really have to look at parental alienation as a child protection matter. In Canada, though, emotional abuse in general is rarely even investigated in many cases. It's simply assumed to be impossible to prove, and child protection authorities often just wash their hands when it comes to forms of emotional abuse. Because parental alienation is an extreme form of emotional abuse of children, the pleas of parents on their children's behalf are largely ignored by professional child and family practitioners in fields like my own, social work. It's also a form of domestic violence, because witnessing the abuse of one's child is actually, when you think about it, a form of domestic violence. Just as witnessing domestic violence is a form of child abuse, it's now recognized to be a severe form of child abuse to see one's parent being abused. So to witness one's child going through experiencing the effects of parental alienation is also very hurtful to a parent. The target parents of alienated children are acutely aware of the devastating effects of parental alienation, and yet they're powerless to act to protect their own children. So, is parental alienation a form of child abuse? No, go back, sorry, yeah. So let's look again at the definition of parental alienation here. Parental alienation involves the programming of a child by one parent to denigrate the other targeted parent in an effort to undermine and interfere with the child's relationship with that parent. The child is either forced to hate the parent or begins to erase the parent from the child's heart and mind. Parental alienation is unjustified estrangement. It doesn't refer to those cases where a child or parent has been victimized by child abuse or family violence and the child is fearful as a result, or by the parent's own abandonment of the child. The estrangement of the target parent is involuntary. We'll move on to the next slide now. This is a really lengthy quote, and maybe I can just leave it to you to read, but I think it's a very key point in this whole discussion that's often overlooked. And this is certainly my own experience in working in the field of child protection. And I think most people in the child protection field will definitely confirm this, that despite the abuse and neglect suffered by foster children or children who have been with overtly abusive parents, it's very uncommon for those children to refuse contact with a parent. Abused children tend to protect and cling to the abusive parent. Moreover, in the rare cases in which that did appear to happen, there was always some evidence of indoctrination or programming, typically by foster parents who had the goal of adopting the child. It's counter-instinctual for a child to reject a parent, even an abusive parent. When a professional observes a child strongly reject a parent in the absence of verified abuse, neglect, or deficient parenting skills, one of the first thoughts should be that the other parent is an alienator. Moreover, one should never assume that because a child has rejected a parent, the parent must have done something to warrant it. And it's something, very often overlooked. Next slide. I mentioned this idea of parental alienation on a continuum. Now, to answer this question, is parental alienation a form of child abuse? I guess it depends on where along the continuum it is. But also, I think it's important to determine whether the definition of parental alienation fits within the definition of child abuse. So child abuse is itself a very contentious and contested notion. But there is consensus that child abuse is a form of harm to children that has two core elements, just as domestic violence has those two core elements. So with child abuse, it's a significant form of harm, and second, its occurrence is attributable to human agency. So it's, first of all, a significant form of harm because it poses a serious threat to the well-being and welfare of a child. So to classify behavior as child abuse, this significant harm must be unambiguous, clearly observable symptoms. Second, the source of the abuse must be the result of human action, neglect being the result of human inaction. Furthermore, this action could be at the hands of an individual caregiver, like a parent, or a form of collective action, like social, legal, political, and economic factors that directly harm children. So these are two of the most common definitions of child abuse. A significant form of harm done or anticipated to a child as a result of human action, and the portion of harm that results from human actions that's prescribed, proximate, and preventable. Next slide. So parental alienation is a form of emotional child abuse, and as a form of abuse, it actually does contain these two features. When we examine the definition of parental alienation, it has these two elements. First, it involves a set of abusive strategies on the part of a parent to foster the child's rejection of the other parent, where children are manipulated to hate the other. So the behavior of the alienator on the one hand, and secondly, that the consequences for the child are severe and significant. Parental alienation is a significant mental disturbance based on a false belief that the alienated parent is dangerous and unworthy. So alienation results, I'll look at the first kind of issue of abusive strategies or behaviors on the part of the alienator. So Amy Baker has done a tremendous amount of research on, and she's come up with 17 strategies that parental alienators commonly use toward children and toward the targeted parent. These tactics are tantamount to extreme psychological maltreatment of children, she writes, including spurning, terrorizing, isolating, corrupting, or exploiting and denying emotional responsiveness. So she talks about these behaviors, bad-mouthing the other parent, limiting contact with that parent, erasing the other parent from the mind of the child, like forbidding discussion and pictures of the other parent, forcing the child to reject the other parent, creating the impression that the other parent is dangerous, etc. So the first defining feature of parental alienation as a form of child abuse is the behavior of the alienator. We see a sense of entitlement, an abuse of power. The parent's hatred of and desire to hurt the other parent is stronger than their love for the child. It's often a sign of the parent's inability to separate from the couple conflict and focus on the needs of the child. The parent's hatred toward the other parent overrides their love for the child. Alienation exists on, as I mentioned, on a continuum from mild or moderate, and Amy Baker actually focuses, most of her work has interviewed parents who experienced alienation, but of the less severe variety. My own research has looked at alienated parents who have absolutely no contact with their children. So this is based on 3 separate studies, two focused on divorced fathers who have had no contact with their kids, and one on non-resident mothers who have no contact with their children. And these are the most common behaviors of severe parental alienators. Next slide. Okay. This is based on interviews, fairly in-depth interviews with 100 alienated parents, both fathers and mothers. And these were the most commonly reported behaviors of parental alienators. First and foremost, seizing the child by force, denying contact, denying access, misusing the legal system to undermine the other parent, to entirely remove the parent from the child's life. Secondly, lack of understanding, attunement, and empathy to children's needs and perceptions, insensitivity to and disregard for the impact of one's behavior on children. So willingness to engage in conflict in front of the children, lack of emotional depth and responsiveness in one's relationship with one's child, parentification of a child, children made to feel responsible for the parent's well-being. Thirdly, refusal to accept responsibility for one's contribution to the problem situation, insistence on being right in all matters or disagreements with the former spouse. Fourthly, a belief in one's entitlement as the primary or sole parental figure in the child's life, a lack of validation or recognition of the other parent. Fifth is an overt or covert obsession with the other parent, with hurting the other parent, so that obsession prevails over one's parental responsibilities. An alienating parent's need to hurt and seek revenge prevails over the child's need for the love and nurture of the other parent. Sixth is a willingness and enthusiasm to engage in adversarial combat and skill and use of power over tactics in the adversarial arena, and readiness to engage in and risk a winner-take-all process. Seventh is a refusal to communicate or engage in negotiation or a third-party intervention like family mediation, lack of good faith in involvement in such processes. Eighth is a readiness to accuse the other party of wrongdoing, quick to blame, and place all responsibility for the conflict onto the other parent. Ninth is a lack of guilt or remorse for one's behavior. 10th is exaggeration and dishonesty, an attitude of the end justifies the means. 11 is bad-mouthing of the other parent in front of the child or avoiding any mention of the other parent in an attempt to erase the parent from the child's memory. And finally, monitoring and questioning the child in regard to the child's relationship with the other parent. Now you can see each of these strategies have a number of functions. The first is to further the child's cohesion and alignment with the alienating parent. Second is to create psychological distance between the child and the targeted parent. Thirdly, the goal is to intensify the target parent's anger and hurt over the child's behavior. And fourthly is to incite conflict between the child and target parent should the target parent challenge or react to the child's behavior. So alienating parents through these types of behaviors are really conveying a 3-part message to the child. The first is, I'm the only parent who loves you and you need me you need me as a parent and you need me to feel good about yourself. Secondly, the other parent is dangerous, unavailable, and doesn't love you. And thirdly, pursuing a relationship with the other parent will jeopardize your relationship with me. So these are all sort of behaviors of the alienator. These are the actions that constitute abuse. The other side of the definition of child abuse is the effects on the child, the harmful effects on the child. The primary manifestation of parental alienation is the child's unjustified campaign of denigration against the parent, in which the children's views are almost exclusively negative to the point where the parent is demonized and seen as evil. So it's a serious mental condition based on a false belief that the alienated parent is dangerous and unworthy. This next slide is kind of the four kind of main effects of parental alienation. Children lose the capacity to give and accept love from a parent. They're manipulated to hate the target parent, despite children's innate desire to love and be loved by both their parents. Their denigration results in the child's emotional rejection of the parent, the loss of a capable and loving parent from their lives. And we know now that such emotional abuse is as debilitating than physical or sexual abuse of children. We also know that children witnessing the abuse of a parent, which is essentially what's happening in parental alienation, is a particularly harmful form of child abuse. So, 4 areas. The first one is self-hatred, particularly disturbing. One of the most serious effects of parental alienation or any form of child abuse. It's fairly common in situations of parental alienation. So teaching hatred of the other parent is tantamount to instilling self-hatred in the child, because children internalize the hatred targeted toward the alienated parent. They're led to believe the alienated parent didn't love them or want them. They experience severe guilt to betraying the alienated parent. Their self-hatred and depression resulting from that is rooted in their belief, their feelings of being unloved by one of their parents and from separation from that parent, while being denied the opportunity to mourn the loss of the parent or even talk about the parent. This kind of hatred of a parent is not an emotion that comes naturally to a child. It has to be taught, and that's one of the more dangerous elements of parental alienation, teaching that kind of hatred that becomes self-hatred. The second kind of key is alienated children exhibit severe psychosocial disturbances. That includes disrupted social emotional development, lack of trust in relationships, social anxiety, and especially social isolation. Alienated children have poor relationships with both of their parents. As adults, they tend to enter partnerships earlier, more likely to divorce and dissolve their cohabiting unions. They're more likely to have children outside any partnership. And according to Amy Baker, alienated children are highly likely to become alienated parents themselves. A third area is lack of low self-sufficiency, lack of autonomy, lingering dependence on the alienating parent. They're more likely to play truant from school, leave school at an early age. They're less likely to attain academic and professional qualifications in adulthood, more likely to experience unemployment, have low incomes, remain on social assistance. They seem to drift aimlessly through life. And finally, alienated children experience difficulties controlling impulses, struggle with addiction and self-harm, more likely to smoke, drink alcohol, abuse drugs, as well as succumb to behavioral addictions, more likely to be promiscuous, and foregoing contraception, becoming teenage parents. So parental alienation very much fits the definition of child abuse in that, first of all, it's a significant form of harm, and its occurrence is attributable to human agency. It's of the 4 different types of abuse: physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and neglect. Parental alienation is usually considered to be a form of serious, severe emotional or psychological abuse, but it also co-occurs with the other types of child abuse. It co-occurs with neglect, because alienating parents' hatred of the target parent is stronger than their love for their child. They're less attuned to and therefore neglect the needs of the child. It's also co-occurs with physical and sexual abuse. Children in situations where one parent is absent from their lives are at greater risk than children who have relationships with both parents. Alienated children are 5 times more likely to have experienced physical abuse and emotional maltreatment. They're exposed to 100 times higher risk of fatal abuse. So I'll just end with kind of a note that there is a lot of controversy still today around the whole concept of parental alienation, but there's an emergent professional consensus. Yes, next slide. So we have, first of all, a growing body of research. I've mentioned now over 1,000 articles and books on the topic of parental alienation. And I think an emergent consensus that this is a severe form of both domestic violence and child abuse. But there's still a lot of professional misunderstanding about its effects. And actually, you know, many will question, should this be considered a form of child maltreatment in particular? So the prevalence of denial and misunderstanding of parental alienation has prompted surveys of child and family social workers, psychologists, and other mental health professionals that are working with children of divorce. Can children actually reject a parent whose behavior doesn't warrant rejection? And if the answer is yes, can this rejection be due to the influence of an alienating parent? So there was a survey taken in 2014 at the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts annual conference. This is a body of legal and mental health practitioners and academics, and that they reported 98% agreement in support of the basic tenet of parental alienation. Children can be manipulated by one parent to reject the other parent who doesn't deserve to be rejected. The DSM-5, parental alienation is an extreme manifestation of 3 disorders in the DSM Diagnostic and Statistical Manual: parent-child relational problem, child affected by parental relationship distress, and child psychological abuse. So parental alienation as parent-child relation problem involves 2 symptom clusters identified in the DSM: impaired functioning in behavioral, cognitive, or affective domains, and, quote, negative attributions of the other's intentions, hostility toward or scapegoating of the other, and unwarranted feelings of estrangement on the part of the child. So the concept of parental alienation is contained in the DSM-5, even though the actual words parental alienation are not in the DSM-5. But parental alienation, the term parental alienation as a disease, as a category, is in fact in the current draft of the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases, the ICD-11, with a specific definition of parental alienation in that document. So turning to implications, this is the final slide. I have no idea if I've kept to the time, but last sort of few remarks. So every child has a fundamental right and need for an unthreatened and loving relationship with both parents, and to be denied that right, that need by one parent without justification like abuse or neglect is an egregious form of child abuse. These children are no less damaged than other children of extreme conflict like child soldiers or other abducted children who identify with their tormentors to avoid pain and maintain a relationship with them, however abusive the relationship may be. Parental alienation is a serious form of emotional child abuse strongly linked to child neglect, and physical and sexual abuse clearly makes it, above all else, a child protection concern. Yet in Canada and elsewhere, emotional abuse of children is rarely even investigated by child protection authorities, simply assumed to be impossible to prove, and more often than not, child protection authorities just wash their hands. But it's a serious form of emotional child abuse which is relatively easily detected and linked to other forms of child abuse. So the first step in combating parental alienation is the recognition by child protection authorities of parental alienation as a form of individual child abuse that warrants a child protection response. But parental alienation as a form of child abuse isn't only the result of individual actions of a parent, but its source is also found in our social policies and family laws. Parental alienation flourishes in situations where one parent has exclusive care and control of a child, and legal systems that remove a parent from a child's life via sole custody or primary residence orders aren't just contributing to parental alienation. In a sense, they're engaging in a form of parental alienation. So parental alienation thrives in an adversarial winner-take-all legal system where parents are forced to denigrate each other as parents as much as possible to prove that they're the superior parent and more worthy of being granted sole custody or primary caregiver status. Parents are almost set up to fight in an effort to win primary residence or custody of their children, and the system rewards those parents who are skilled in adversarial combat. Parents often win their case by disparaging the other parent as a parent, in effect engaging in alienating behaviors, and the system encourages and produces and rewards alienating behavior. We know that parental alienation is more likely to occur in jurisdictions where child residence is, in disputed cases, is awarded to one parent only. And it's least likely to occur in those states which have legislated a presumption of shared parenting. Shared parenting law, which is a legal sanctioning of the fact that children have two primary parents, is a bulwark against parental alienation. So really there's no great mystery about parental alienation. If we legally permit parental alienation, parents will abuse. If we provide consequences for engaging in parental alienation within a legal presumption of shared parenting, parental alienation will diminish. So the second step in combating parental alienation as a form of collective child abuse is one that involves a fundamental reform of the family law system, specifically a rebuttable legal presumption of shared parenting responsibility to prevent parental alienation from occurring in the first place. So I'll end my presentation with this proposal for addressing the problem of parental alienation, a four-pillar approach for addressing parental alienation. I think I see each of these as essential in any campaign to combat parental alienation as a form of child abuse. I've already spoken about these first two pillars, which I think are the most important. This harm reduction, addressing parental alienation as a form of individual child abuse and a child protection matter. And secondly, prevention, addressing parental alienation as a form of collective child abuse by means of a rebuttable legal presumption of shared parenting responsibility. The third pillar is that of treatment or intervention, mental health intervention, which is a very sensitive issue. We know from any number of studies that alienated children seem to have a secret wish for someone to actually call their bluff, for someone to compel them to reconnect with the parent they claim to hate. And despite very strongly held positions of alignment, alienated children want nothing more than to be given the permission and freedom to love and be loved by both parents. So research has shown that many alienated children transform quickly from refusing or staunchly resisting the rejected parent to be able to show and receive love from that parent. But that's followed by an equally swift shift back to the alienated position when they're back in the orbit of the alienating parent. So, big question and controversy in the field is, what about children's wishes regarding their living arrangements in contested cases? Important to consider, but that should not determine the actual living arrangements in situations of parental alienation. Because there's a disconnect between what children say they want and what they truly desire. Reunification efforts should be undertaken by service providers with specialized training and expertise in parental alienation reunification. There have been a number of models of intervention developed. The best known is Richard Warshak Family Bridges program in Texas, which is a educative and experiential program focused on allowing children to have healthy relationships with both parents, removing the child from the parental conflict, encouraging child autonomy, multiple perspective taking, and critical thinking. There are a number of programs, but virtually all reunification programs emphasize children coming to regard their parents as equally valued and important in their lives, and at the same time helping enmeshed alienated children relinquish their protective role toward their alienating parents. I hear from a lot of alienated parents, both fathers and mothers, and the main message, I can't really say a lot except never give up. Even in the face of hostility and rejection from your children, respond with compassion, emotional availability, and absolute safety, unconditional love. Being there for your child is the best response that you can provide your children, even in the face of the sad truth that it might not be enough to bring back your children. I agree with Richard Warshak that one of the, wherever possible, alienated parents should try to expose their children to people who regard them as parents with honor and respect, to let children see that their negative opinion and the opinion of the alienating parent is not shared by the rest of the world. That will leave a stronger impression on the child than anything than the parent, the target parent, can say on his or her own behalf. And finally, enforcement is the final pillar. There's a role for the judicial system to play, even with a legal presumption of shared parenting, and that's the enforcement of shared parenting orders. However, enforcement is easier when neither parent is threatened by the potential loss of his or her children, and enforcement of shared parenting orders is much easier than the law enforcement nightmare we now have when one parent is excluded from a child's daily life by primary residence orders. Also, the judicial system has an important role to play in situations of domestic violence where a legal presumption against shared parenting should apply. So, for parental alienation to be recognized and accepted as on par with other forms of domestic violence and serious child maltreatment, we need a very clear and precise definition of parental alienation and the exact nature of the harm befalling parents and children as a result of parental alienation should be unambiguous. And I think we're now at that point. Clearly, we're at that point. The current state of knowledge is that we have a clear and precise definition of parental alienation, level requiring fundamental reform of the family law system. And I think I'll end with that and welcome your questions and any discussion, although I think we'll take a break before we... Yeah, thanks.